On a sunny afternoon in 1956, the quiet town of Westbury, New York, became the setting for a tragedy that would grip the nation. 1-month-old Peter Weinberger was taken from his family's back porch, sparking a frantic search and one of the most chilling kidnapping cases in American history. As the Weinbergers battled despair and the police pursued leads, the nation watched in horror. What began as a ransom demand soon unraveled into a story of desperation, media chaos, and devastating loss.
On July 4, 1956, the quiet suburban neighborhood of Westbury, New York, was the scene of a crime that would shock the nation. The Weinberger family home, located at 17 Albemarle Road, was bustling with holiday preparations. Betty Weinberger, a young mother, had just finished feeding her 1-month-old son, Peter, and placed him in his baby carriage on the back patio. It was a warm summer afternoon, and the neighborhood seemed as tranquil as ever. Leaving Peter for what she thought would be just a few moments, Betty stepped inside to retrieve a clean diaper. When she returned less than 10 minutes later, her heart dropped. The carriage was empty. Frantically searching the yard, she realized her baby was gone. Inside the carriage, she found a small piece of paper, a ransom note demanding $2,000 in exchange for Peter's safe return. The note threatened harm if the family involved the police. The Weinberger family quickly contacted the Nassau County Police Department, who arrived within the hour. The ransom note instructed the family to drop the money near the corner of Albemarle Road and Park Avenue, but this created immediate confusion. There were two intersections where the streets met. Officers decided to place a decoy envelope at one of the corners while staking out both locations. Fearing that media attention might jeopardize Peter's safety, authorities requested a 24-hour media blackout to allow the ransom drop to proceed without interference. Most news outlets complied, but the New York Daily News broke the story on its evening front page, sparking a media frenzy. Reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers swarmed the neighborhood and the drop-off locations, unintentionally sabotaging the operation. The next day, the kidnapper failed to appear at the designated site, and the money remained untouched. The family's hopes of a quick and peaceful resolution began to fade. Investigators expanded their efforts, combing the area for witnesses. Two local boys reported seeing a shabbily dressed man driving a 1951 Plymouth near the Weinberger home around the time Peter disappeared. They estimated the man was around 5'9", but further leads were scarce. In a desperate attempt to draw the kidnapper out, authorities held a press conference, claiming that Peter required a special baby formula available only through a pharmacist. They hoped the kidnapper would attempt to obtain the formula and inadvertently expose himself. However, the plan failed, yielding no new information. Over the next few days, the kidnapper made phone calls to the Weinberger home, speaking with Peter's father, Morris. During these tense conversations, he instructed Morris to leave the money at various locations along the Northern State Parkway, including exits 26 and 28. Despite complying with the demands, the kidnapper never appeared, leaving behind a second ransom note in one instance but no further clues. The family was left in a state of anguish, and police feared the worst as the hours turned into days. After a week with no further contact, the FBI officially joined the investigation, as federal law required a 7-day waiting period before they could intervene in kidnapping cases. The FBI brought in additional resources, including handwriting experts who carefully analyzed the ransom notes. Their scrutiny revealed unique characteristics in the kidnapper's handwriting, particularly a distinct lowercase m that resembled a sideways Z, along with quirks in 15 other letters. Using these details, investigators began cross-referencing public records and private correspondence in search of a match. The breakthrough came when a probation officer in Brooklyn identified the handwriting in his files. It belonged to Angela LaMarca, a 31-year-old mechanic from Plainview, New York, who had recently completed probation for a bootlegging conviction. LaMarca, a married father of 2, was struggling with financial difficulties. Deeply in debt, he owed approximately $1,800 and had turned to kidnapping as a desperate attempt to solve his money problems. Surveillance confirmed that LaMarca owned a 1951 Plymouth, matching the vehicle described by witnesses near the Weinberger home. When police arrested LaMarca, he initially denied involvement but quickly broke under pressure. During his confession, he revealed a horrifying truth. After panicking over the extensive media coverage, he abandoned Peter in a wooded area near exit 37 of the Northern State Parkway. He claimed he had intended to return for the baby but was too afraid of being caught. On August 24, 1956, nearly 7 weeks after Peter's disappearance, LaMarca led authorities to the site. There, they discovered the infant's remains, just 150 feet from the eastbound service road. The coroner determined that Peter had died from starvation, exposure, and asphyxia, likely within days of being left in the woods. The tragic discovery devastated the Weinberger family and horrified the public, who had clung to the hope that Peter might still be alive. LaMarca's confession revealed chilling details of his actions. On the day of the kidnapping, he had been driving aimlessly when he noticed Betty placing Peter in the carriage. Acting on impulse, he snatched the baby and left the ransom note. Despite his later regret, his fear of capture prevented him from taking steps to save Peter's life. LaMarca's trial began in late 1956, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including his confession, the ransom notes, and witness testimony. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned the crime, despite his later claims of regret. LaMarca's defense argued that he had been temporarily insane due to the immense financial pressure he faced. They portrayed him as a desperate father who made a terrible mistake, hoping to gain the jury's sympathy. However, the evidence showed that LaMarca had taken calculated steps to avoid detection, undermining the insanity defense. The trial captivated the nation, with newspapers covering every detail. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict, guilty of felony first-degree murder. In December 1956, LaMarca was sentenced to death by electrocution. LaMarca spent nearly 2 years on death row at Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York. During this time, he expressed remorse for his actions, claiming he never intended for Peter to die. Despite appeals for clemency, the courts upheld his sentence. On the night of August 7, 1958, LaMarca was executed in the electric chair, bringing an end to one of Long Island's most infamous criminal cases. The Weinberger family, devastated by their loss, retreated from the public eye. Their home at 17 Albemarle Road became a grim reminder of the tragedy. Though they sought to rebuild their lives, the shadow of Peter's death lingered. The case had far-reaching consequences, prompting changes in how law enforcement handled kidnappings. The mandatory 7-day waiting period for FBI involvement was criticized, leading to reforms that allowed for quicker federal intervention. The FBI also enhanced its forensic capabilities, including advancements in handwriting analysis. Today, the Peter Weinberger case remains a haunting chapter in true crime history. It highlights the devastating consequences of desperation and poor choices, as well as the fragility of life. Decades later, the story of Peter Weinberger continues to resonate, serving as a cautionary tale and a reminder of the enduring impact of loss.
All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're diving deep into a case that really shook America. The Peter Weinberger kidnapping. It happened on July 4th, 1956. Just picture it. A perfect summer day in Westbury, New York.
Ah, the 4th of July.
Yeah.
Families out celebrating, fireworks.
The whole bit.
Yeah, you got it.
And the Weinbergers, Betty and Morris, are at home with their 1-month-old baby, Peter.
And you know what's so fascinating about this case? It's like it takes this perfect picture of, classic American life.
Right.
And just turns it into a total nightmare. It really gets to those deep fears we all have, especially as parents, about keeping our kids safe.
Absolutely. It's almost too scary to even think about. So here's what happened. Betty goes inside their house for just a couple of minutes, leaving baby Peter outside on the patio in his carriage. She's not gone long at all, but when she comes back, the carriage is empty. Peter's gone.
Just gone.
Gone.
And in his place, they find something truly chilling. A ransom note. The kidnapper wants $2,000, and he makes it absolutely clear that if the police get involved, something terrible will happen to the baby. Can you imagine the sheer terror the Weinbergers must have felt in that moment?
Just unimaginable.
It's every parent's worst nightmare, right?
Totally. So naturally, the Nassau County Police are called in right away. They know they need to act fast and smart. So their first move is to set a trap.
Okay, how do they do that?
They get a decoy envelope ready with the ransom money inside.
Makes sense.
But here's where it gets tricky. The ransom note actually gives 2 different places for the drop-off.
Oh.
Both places are at the corner of Albemarle Road and Park Avenue, but in totally different parts of town.
Oh, wow. So that must throw them off a bit.
Definitely. So what do the police do? They decide to stake out both locations, hoping to catch the kidnapper red-handed, and they try to keep everything hush-hush. They don't want to scare the kidnapper off. It seems like a good plan, right?
Sounds pretty solid so far.
But then word gets out. The New York Daily News puts the whole story right on their front page.
Oh, no.
And suddenly Westbury is swarming with reporters, photographers, you name it.
So much for keeping it quiet.
It's a media frenzy, and it basically blows the police's whole plan wide open.
Oh, that's got to be frustrating for them. It's a classic example of how things can backfire, even when people have good intentions, Especially when the media gets involved.
Absolutely. And things are about to get even worse.
Oh, boy.
The kidnapper never shows up at either of the drop-off points. Hope starts to fade as the hours turn into days, and still, no sign of Peter. The only lead the police have is from 2 young boys who say they saw a man near the Weinbergers' house right around the time Peter disappeared.
Interesting. What did they actually see?
Okay, so they describe this guy as being kind of shabbily dressed, and he was driving a 1951 Plymouth. Not a whole lot to go on, but it's something.
Right. Any little detail could help.
Yeah. And the police are desperate, so they come up with this pretty wild plan to try and lure the kidnapper out.
What do they do? I gotta hear.
They plant a story in the news. The story says that baby Peter needs a very specific type of formula, and that it's only available from one particular pharmacist. They're hoping that the kidnapper, needing to take care of Peter, would try to get the formula and lead the police right to him.
Wow. That's pretty clever, but also risky. Did it work?
Sadly, no. The kidnapper doesn't even try to get the formula. And then things get even more intense because the kidnapper actually calls Peter's dad, Morris, directly.
He calls Morris on the phone.
Yep.
Twice.
Oh, man, this is getting scary.
Each time he calls, he gives new instructions and changes the location for the ransom drop-off. He's sending Morris all over the Northern State Parkway, playing this terrifying game of cat and mouse.
Wow, it's like he's toying with them. And the fear for Peter's safety must have been just unbearable with each failed meeting.
Absolutely. And at one of these fake drop-off locations, the police find another ransom note, another reminder that they're dealing with someone who's both dangerous and very clever.
It's chilling. A whole week goes by and there's still no real progress. The Weinbergers are in agony, and the police are struggling to make any headway. But this is where things change a bit because a new group gets involved.
I'm guessing you're talking about the FBI.
You got it. After a mandatory 7-day waiting period, which seems crazy in a case like this, the FBI finally steps in. They bring a whole new level of expertise and resources to the investigation, and they really focus on one key piece of evidence: the ransom notes.
Ah, the handwriting. And remember, this is 1956, no DNA analysis or fancy technology like we have today.
Right, they're working with what they've got. So the FBI goes through those notes with a fine-tooth comb, comparing them to tons of other writing samples, looking for any little detail that could help them break the case open.
It's like searching for a needle in a haystack.
It really is. And you know what? They actually find something. The kidnapper writes his lowercase m in a very strange way, almost like a sideways Z. Plus, there are 15 other little quirks in his handwriting that make it unique.
So they basically have a fingerprint, a way to identify him.
Exactly. This is where the investigation takes a huge turn. They start going through records, trying to match this handwriting to anyone they can find.
I bet this is where we get to some really intense detective work.
Oh yeah, and their hard work pays off. The big break comes from a pretty unexpected source.
Wasn't a psychic, was it?
Not quite. It was a probation officer over in Brooklyn. He was going through some files and noticed that the handwriting in the ransom notes looked really familiar.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, he realized it belonged to Angela Lamarca, a 31-year-old mechanic he'd worked with recently.
So now they've got Lamarca on their radar. Who is this guy? What's his deal?
Well, turns out Lamarca had a recent conviction for bootlegging. But more importantly, he was deep in debt, owing almost $1,800. That's a huge amount for back then, like $20,000 in today's money.
Yeah, that kind of financial pressure can make people do some crazy things.
But kidnapping, that's a whole other level.
It's a desperate move for sure. And get this, remember those witnesses who saw that shabbily dressed guy driving a 51 Plymouth?
Yeah. Lamarca owned a car that matched the description perfectly.
Oh, wow.
The pieces are starting to fall into place.
So what happens next? They bring Lamarca in for questioning.
Yep. A mechanic in debt, a criminal record, a car that matches witness descriptions. The evidence is really piling up.
You can't deny that's suspicious.
Right. And at first, Lamarca denies everything. But as the pressure mounts, he finally cracks and tells them the truth. What he reveals is a story of desperation, panic, and ultimately tragedy.
Oh man, this is heavy. What does he confess to? What happened?
Lamarca admits that he took Peter, but he says he panicked because of all the media attention.
Oh, all those reporters swarming the place.
Exactly. So he drove to a wooded area near Exit 37 on the Northern State Parkway and left Peter there. He claims that he planned to go back for him later, but he got too scared and never did.
Oh my God. That's just heartbreaking. So did they find Peter?
Yes, but tragically, it was too late. On August 24th, 1956, nearly 7 weeks after he disappeared, Lamarca led the authorities to where he had left Peter.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like for everyone involved.
It was devastating. They found Peter's remains just 150 feet from the service road. The coroner's report was awful. Peter had died from starvation, exposure, and asphyxia, most likely within days of being abandoned. It was a crushing blow for the Weinbergers and for everyone who had been hoping for a miracle.
Just absolutely tragic. What happens to Lamarca after all this?
Well, with his confession and all the evidence against him, he's facing some serious charges. His trial begins in late 1956, and it becomes a real battle of two very different stories.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean? So they're basically presenting two completely different versions of what happened, right?
Yeah, one side is saying Lamarca was this cold, calculating criminal who planned the whole thing just for the money. They wanted the death penalty, saying that what he did showed he didn't care about human life at all.
It's hard to believe someone could be so desperate that they would do something like that.
I know. But Lamarca's lawyers, they had a different take. They said that he was basically driven temporarily insane because of all his money problems. They insisted that he never wanted Peter to die, that what he did was just a desperate, messed up attempt to fix his life.
Wow, so you have these two totally different ways of looking at the same events.
Yeah.
A cold-hearted criminal versus a desperate man who made a terrible mistake. So what did the jury think? How did they see it?
The jury talked it over for just a few hours, and then they came back with their verdict: guilty of felony first-degree murder.
Wow.
The fact that they decided so quickly, it really shows how strong the evidence was against him and how much this whole tragedy affected everyone.
Makes sense.
It was December 1956, and LaMarca was sentenced to death by electrocution.
That's heavy. Can you imagine being in that courtroom, all those emotions swirling around, grief, anger, maybe even a little bit of relief that justice was served, but also maybe some people wondering if things could have gone differently?
I bet it was intense. And as LaMarca was sitting on death row at Sing Sing, he actually said he was sorry for what he'd done. He said he regretted everything and never meant for Peter to die.
Almost too much to think about. A little baby.
I know. There were appeals to try and get him a lighter sentence, but none of them worked.
It's a tough situation all around, you know. You have this horrible act, a young life cut short, and then you have this guy driven by desperation, making choices that led to such awful consequences.
It really makes you think about those moments in life where things could have gone a different way, the choices we make.
It does. It also shows just how limited law enforcement was back then. Think about it, a 7-day waiting period before the FBI could get involved. Can you imagine that now?
It seems crazy, right? With all the technology and resources they have today.
Totally. It makes you wonder how many cases could have ended differently if the FBI had been able to step in sooner. You know, I think the Weinberger case really changed things. It got people talking about how we handle kidnapping cases, how we need to be faster and have better tools to solve them.
And the handwriting analysis. It's amazing that they were able to identify LaMarca just from the way he wrote. Back then, they didn't have DNA testing or anything like that.
It just shows you the power of really paying attention to details. They were putting together a puzzle, using every little piece of information they could find to figure out who did it.
So even though Peter's story is so sad, in a way, it helped improve the way law enforcement works.
Yeah, you could say that. It's like finding a little bit of good in a really dark situation.
But we can't forget about the media's role in all of this. The New York Daily News, breaking that news blackout, probably had a big impact on how everything went down. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's a tricky thing, the media's involvement in cases like this. They have a responsibility to keep the public informed, but they also have to be careful not to mess with investigations or put people in danger.
It seems like all the media attention might have been part of why LaMarca panicked and decided to abandon the baby.
Yeah, it's a tough lesson about how good intentions can sometimes backfire.
And it's something we still see today with social media and everything. Information spreads so fast now. It's more important than ever to be responsible with what we share.
So true. I think the Weinberger case is a good reminder of how much power the media has and how we need to use that power carefully.
For sure. At the end of the day, the Weinberger case reminds us that behind every crime, there are real people whose lives are changed forever. The victims, their families, and even the person who committed the crime.
We can't forget that.
Absolutely. So after all this, what do you think is the most important thing to remember about the Peter Weinberger case? What do you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the biggest thing is to remember that even though this happened a long time ago, it still matters today. What happened in 1956 still affects how we do things now. It's a reminder that we need to keep working to make things better, to learn from the past.
Well said. And on that note, I want to leave everyone with this question. How do you think this case has changed the way we think about kidnapping? Has it changed how we raise our kids? How we feel about the police and the justice system? It's something to think about.
Yeah, it really is. And maybe if we talk about these difficult things and face our own fears, we can make the world a little bit safer and a little bit fairer for everyone.
That's a great point. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.